Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Minority Report here at the Revolutionary Conservative. Today we are going to have a very interesting discussion between the editors of Arktos Media. They also have their own podcast called Interregnum. Here is with us John Bruce Leonard.
It's a pleasure to be on with you. Thank you very much for having us.
And it's also with us Martin Locker.
Hello, lovely to be here.
And today is going to be a discussion between these guys and us, the identitarians in Peru. We are going to have a discussion of many interesting political thinkers of this new time and age, which are going to, we have already addressed them in the description of the video. If you will, you can go there and check who we are going to discuss about. And we also have today with us the leader of the Peruvian identitarian movement, also known as Youth for the Second Republic. Here with us is Israel Lira.
Hi to everyone. A pleasure to meet here, Alejandro.
Yeah, and also with us is, of course, our usual suspects and panelists. Here with us is Rafael. How you doing?
Hey, so I think I'm going to do more listening than talking. There's a lot of information going on.
Yeah, and Doug as well. Hey, Doug.
Hey guys, yeah, right there with Raphael. I think we're going to do a little bit of listening, maybe a little moderating if we got some questions in the chat for some of our new listeners. But yeah, glad to have you guys.
Yeah. So right now we like we were discussing previously on the pre-show. There has been interesting developments within these last decades within not only Europe but also as well North and South America. Central America is kind of stale at the moment, but that's because of the situation that it is right now. It's like saying, the Middle East is stale in political theory at the moment as well. It's because of the current situation that they are in. But in any case, those of us who have the luxury to be in this position that we can actually discuss other thinkers, other ideas, other philosophies, I believe we should make this happen, and we should have, like Alexander Dugin says, a discussion between different civilizations instead of trying to impose one civilization and one paradigm or one ideology into all of us, into all of the other that are not like this. And we see this in the works, like, for example, people like Francis Fukuyama, or even the Clash of Civilizations by Huntington. They are all saying that there should be a clash between, or they are trying to frame it like that. There's going to be a clash between Islam and the West, and South America is also going to be involved, and all these kind of crazy things. But it's not actually that. It is the reality is that neoliberalism, and most importantly, in the correct terminology right now, post-liberalism is the one that is trying to put everyone at each other's throats because it wants to be imposed as the one world government, one reigning ideology all over the world, and this is the real crisis of today, I would say. So I don't know.
I think I will say individualism, capitalism, and liberal democracy. That is the principal aspect.
So any of you guys have anything to add to this previous analysis to our discussion?
I think the analysis that you've just provided is very much right on, Zero. I mean, I think that we're at a very interesting historical moment in the present time, in which the reigning world order, which has been imposed in large measure through European intervention in many corners of the globe, which has been essentially a liberalistic order, is now coming into a moment of severe crisis. And this fact obviously opens up a great many possibilities for what might come next. Indeed, it opens up the possibility of actually determining some kind of change from the status quo ante what came before. And I think that the fact that we find ourselves in this position where in all different parts of the world, everyone in the kind of dissident communities are asking the same sorts of questions, which is to say, how did we get to this point? What exactly is this order which has brought us to this position in which we, in many cases, find ourselves involved in conflicts that are unnecessary and are leading to much more chaos and bloodshed and, in many cases, suffering than is certainly necessary. So what led us to this point, and how are we going to begin to get out of it? And I think that the ability to look at this from a multiplicity of different perspectives, including different geographical perspectives, including perspectives from different countries, from different peoples, is absolutely necessary, because it's clear that if you remain within the system and you don't have any means of breaking free of it, you're going to remain entrapped in exactly the same sorts of ideas, and you won't be able to get any kind of fresh perspective on your position, on your situation, and on the crisis which you're attempting to confront.
Yeah, I think that it's the very essence of what is happening today, because, for example, here in Peru, the people are really tired of liberalism, but there is no other political option. We have social democracy, we have little movements, Marxist, but all of these views have failed to respond to the political views or the political requirements of Peruvian society. So the same realm that is denoted by Dugin is also happening in all the world, and principally in South America. We have the recognition of the victory of liberalism and the defeat of all alternatives to it. And here in Peru, it's happening that also. We have that liberalism is not a party. We have no liberal party, but the government is liberal. It's a technocracy that, like Alain de Benoist noted, also that this process of depoliticization ensures the principle of governance, in instance. Furthermore, Marxism is just post-Marxism. There is no longer more fascism. We have post-fascism. We have alt-right movements. We have, and there is no longer liberalism. Is only post-liberalism, and post-liberalism is the expansion of liberalism in all political, economical, and social reality. And Peru, we also have that. And product of this situation, the four political theory of Alexander Dugin bring us a new context or a new possibility in the construction of new theoretical systems. And in our particular context, Peruvian context, the four political theory gains its relevance because we need in Peru a new political option, because Peruvian societies already tired of liberalism, tired of Marxism, tired of fascism. Well, we don't have a fascist government specifically, but Peruvian political society is very tired of political traditional visions. And we don't have, Peruvians don't have a principal salvation for that. We have corruption. We have these events of Brazilian corruption, like Odebrecht, that is a total rate of corruption between politics. We have our president and four presidents investigated by corruption. We have Alejandro Toledo. We have Alan Garcia. We have Pedro Pablo Kacynzki. We have Ollantumala. That Ollantumala is a paradigmatical case because it was the opportunity to establish like a theoretical system, a Peruvian theoretical system called the Andean Amazonic Socialism. It was a project of mixed ideology with nationalism and socialism, but totally failed in corruption, in degeneracy, and also between it was a very discriminatory project because you are talking about Andean or you are talking about Amazonian, but where are the Ibero-American, or where are the European descendants? Where are the Hispanic descendants? Where are they?
Where are
They
the
are
African descendants as well?
exactly. So the reaction, or the theoretical reaction to this context, to this Peruvian context, leads to the necessity, to the imperative necessity of a political theory, of a new political theory that surpass liberalism, that surpass Marxism, that surpass fascism. And this is the connection point between Crisolism and the four political theory of Alexander Dugin. And principally, the aspect of the design. The aspect of the design is very important for us as Crisolists too, because the interpretation of design that we do is related to the principal aspects that are related to the being of the nation. And the being of the Peruvian nation, we denote it as, for example, traditions, customs, folklore, ideas, intellectual production. That is the particular interpretation of design. It's a sociological, objective interpretation that we denoted. So the design, the Peruvian design, is Peruvianness, and Peruvianness is all aspects that generate an identity. And Peruvian identity is related to two aspects. We have the reigns and theocracies in the past with Moches, we have Chavín, we have Incas, etc. We have all imperial tradition of indigenous tradition. Then we have the viceroyalty of Peru. We were part of Spain, and we have the Catholic perspective. So Crisolism, what does is a syncretism between these two powerful cultural aspects. Because in Peru, Marxism focused only in an indigenous view. So that led to a total mess in the 90s called the Age of Terrorism with Sendero Luminoso.
For you guys, it's actually the Luminous Path political party.
The Luminous Path, that was a communist guerrilla that practically destroyed all aspects of society, because there were attacks, terror attacks, bombs, etc. And following the Berlin Wall, the dichotomy or the dialectical interpretation of Marxism in Peru changed between class fight to race fight. So there was more the proletarian against the bourgeois. No, in Peru was the indigenous against the Creole, the descendant, the European descendant. So that determined a total clash, a total race clash in the 90s, and called the epoch of terrorism. We have 60,000 deaths, etc. Was a total mess. And that is the principal reason why Peruvians don't want more, or are very, how do you say, resentimiento? Resentment to the left. They have a total resentment to the left because they fail to bring a possibility of an alternative modernity to Peru. And then, for example, in that moment was the leader of this party, of this Marxist-Leninist, Maoist, and also called Pensamiento Gonzalo thought. They thought that the revolution is devoted principally, but to the count, to the city, as a Maoist perception. But this terrorist movement, in the end, kill many of indigenous communities. So between a total contradiction in an aspect. So that is the reason why Peruvians are very resentment with the left in general. And well, liberalism is just in Peru is practical in all the governments of our country, and we have an issue with mining. Mining is the principal economic production of our country, no? And liberalism has centered all his politics in mining, and we have a very how do you say, a very difficult issue with that, with indigenous communities that are affected with the products of mining. We have cases of intoxication. We have cases of children with poisonous materials, etc. But due to this economic conception of liberalism, this doesn't matter, because it's only the economical beneficial of the state. It's only the economical beneficial of the state in that aspect. So due to all this context, Peruvian in general are also tired of liberalism, but we don't have another option instead of liberalism. We are tired of Marxism, but we don't have another option apart of Marxism. And well, fascism, well, I was the leader of a fascist movement a long time ago, and I denoted that the fascist proposal for Peru failed because it was only relationated with the state as a political subject. As we know, liberalism has the political subject of the individual. Socialism, communism has the political subject that is class, and fascism has the political subject that is the state. But this conception in Peru, the Peruvian fascism, in which I tried to construct in that time, a long time ago, by talking about 3, 4, 5 years ago, fails because this conception that only considers the state as only political reality. And in Peru, we don't only have the state. We have indigenous communities, we have social collectives, we have all kind of movements that also contribute to the construction of a political view. So this is why fascism in Peru fails as a political proposal. And then we encounter with the project of Alexander Dugin, the four political theory that enlightens all the necessities of the new paradigm in Peru, no? A new political ideology, a new political vision, a recognition of the victory of liberalism, the advent of a new Peruvian political theory, and principally a monolithic unit that ensures a great political vital space, the importance of the geopolitical view. And that is the principal aspects that Crisolism considers neuralgic between the four political theory of Alexander Dugin and our view of the four political theory of that.
So guys, you have any questions or any precisions that you want to make?
Well, I'm struck in particular measure by the similarities of the situation that you've described in Peru, and also the differences, the discrepancies. And I think that that's an interesting point to focus on. There are many similarities with what you've described with respect to the situation in the United States, with respect to the situation in Europe. It seems that to a certain extent we are all struggling underneath the shadow of the same monster, as it were. You know,
Yeah.
we're all fighting against this kind of liberal or neoliberal order, which is coming to a point that it can no longer continue the way that it has been. It can no longer exert an unambiguous hegemony over the world, because its internal contradictions are coming to the fore in such a way that it becomes clear that its idea of progress, its idea of continuation, will eventually lead it directly into ruin and into destruction, into self-destruction, perhaps. And so, I mean, to that extent, many of the social dynamics and the problems that you've identified within Peru strike me as being very, very similar to what I've experienced in the United States. Maybe, for example, the question of this focus of Marxism, which began on the classes and then shifted to a kind of racial element or to an ethnic element or to focusing on minority groups as such. That same thing happened in the United States and is happening also in Europe. And this focus on money as well, on economism, this kind of really overbearing and completely unbalanced preoccupation with economic growth. Also not recognizing the fact that economic growth has to have a natural end. You cannot continue growing indefinitely. Nothing can continue growing indefinitely. So, I mean, all of these things, these seem to be very, very similar problems throughout the entirety of the West today. And it's very interesting to hear the extent to which they're shared as well in Peru. At the same time, there are also very specific differences which you seem to be confronting with respect to European states, with respect to the United States, I mean, to Canada, to Australia, to essentially the entirety of the nations that sprang out of European populations. And these specific problems demand a specific kind of response. They demand a localized approach, one that no longer seeks this kind of overweening and arrogant one-size-fits-all political approach, which attempts to impose on every single state in all of the world exactly the same political order, with the understanding that if these institutions are in place, somehow all of these problems can magically be dealt with, when in fact that's not the case. There are differences between nations. There are differences in geography. There are differences in populations. There are differences in habits and traditions, in speech, and all manner of different, a whole gamut of different differences which go into the production of a specific area, specific country or nation. And these deserve their own individualized political approach. I mean, one of the great promising events of the modern times is the degree to which this crisis has opened up the possibility of a more very strictly identitarian approach to the problems that are facing us, rather than this kind of globalized liberal order which needs to be roughly the same in every corner of the globe. And so, I mean, it seems to me that the differences that you're confronting, the differences between the state of affairs in Peru and the state of affairs in other Western countries, seems to me to indicate the necessity of not opening simply, a fourth position or a fourth political theory, but one that is even specific to the place in which one lives.
Yeah, basically, that's why I have been calling this, because we are also known as, in the world, that we have the best food, for political theory, but with a Peruvian spice, because it fits our current situation, and we're Hispanics, so spice speak, it fits completely. That's basically our idea on how we need to have a much bigger understanding, a much broader idea on how to conceive what a civilization is, or what the political theory in big broader terms should be. But they all have to have this particularity that it's completely tailor-made to the country or civilization or even society that they want to be applied to. Because, for example, we can conceive a Persian for political theory that is going to have Islam as well, or for example, a Syrian one. But despite that, they are even if they share some elements, they are still going to have certain elements that make them different.
For example, Alejandro, I would like to talk about specifically. Well, we have three principal influence in Crisolism. First one is Alexander Dugin. Second one is Alain de Benoist, and third one is Guillaume Faye. But this is a part of our philosophical Peruvian influence, where we have a lot of authors of Peruvian influence that also have denoted a reaction to the modernity, a reaction to the linear progress conception. No, for example, we have Wagner de Reina, we have Bolmar Fuensalida, we have, for example, Tuturburu, and there are the authors that I mentioned are Peruvian philosophers, no, that also react to to this linear conception of progress, no. But for example, in the aspect of Guillaume Faye, and a little the Fayean legacy in Peru is the basis of a Peruvian Archeofuturist conception, which foresees a harmony between a traditional vision of the different ethnic groups, no, that make up Peruvianness, as also denoted, the sign, and the idea of a harmonious techno-scientific and socio-economic progress, no, because Guillaume Faye calls the harmony or the dialectical harmony between archaism and futurism. So in Peru, this we interpret it in the next way. As also denoted, the vision between the different ethnic groups that make up Peruvianness. We have Creole, we have indigenous, we have African descendants, we have Asian descendants. This related to the traditional visions of these ethnic groups. And we have also the techno-scientific advances, socioeconomic progress, etc. But for example, we have, as I also denoted, the mining aspect, the Amazonian aspect, that I will be briefly resume of the principal problems of that. No, Archeofuturism in Peru is facing the dangers of an ideal of indefinite progress, no, embodied in an instrumentalist vision of nature that have generated too many problems here in Peru. We have the illegal mining in Mar de Dios. We have the collapse of tailing mines in Ancash. We have oil spills in the Amazon. We have the depredation of ecological reserves such as Chapari, that this is a zone of Peru. The increasing risk, the narco traffic, the increasing risk of extinction endangered species, and the exacerbated deforestation that lead to the loss of, I remember, 164,662 hectares of Amazonic of Amazonian rainforest in 2016, which endangered a healthy environment. And
I'm sorry, that loss, all of that loss of the rainforest was just in a single year.
Yes.
It's appalling.
Yes. That's in 2016. And that is the way that Archeofuturism is a perfect proposal for Peruvian reality, Peruvian realm, because it foresees an equilibrium and harmony between the traditional visions of these Amazonian communities, of these indigenous communities that are very related to the land, to their lands. No, because we have here in Peru Amazonian reserves, and these Amazonian reserves are tribes, are indigenous communities that are affected with these economic productions, mining, etc. No, deforestation, etc. No, so Archeofuturism in Peru is expanded or based between the harmony, the dialectical harmony between these conceptions of tradition in these communities, in these Amazonian communities, and harmonious techno-scientific and socio-economic progress. No, that doesn't affect the live space of these communities. No, and that is the legacy of Faye, for example, in Peru.
Yeah.
The harmony between the traditional conception of these communities between nature, because these Amazonian communities are very related to nature. They are a conception, a Weltanschauung of these communities related to nature. They have spirits, or all is conception that it have is a spiritual realm. The tree is alive. The animals all have spirits. There are a spiritual realm that transcended all his cosmovision. And this between the another aspect, because Peru is especially their principal economic production is mining. We don't have industry. We only have mining, and this is a principal economic aspect. So that is why Archeofuturism in Peru also is related to the promotion of more of a diversification of the production. No, not only related to mining, if related to the another ways of being or produce industry like renewable energies. No, so Archeofuturism in Peru is taking that path, is taking a path of a harmony between tradition and progress, taking a path, a harmony between the conception, the traditional conception of these Amazonian communities, of these indigenous communities, of the ethnic groups, and harmonious advance, a technical certificate advance, a social progress, a socio-economic progress that it don't affect the living space of these ethnic groups.
Yeah, something.
And this is, for example, in only the Fayean legacy. This is a particular application of his thought in Peru, and we have the application of the conception of Benoist of governance. We have the application, for example, of Dugin, of the Dasein, the Peruvianness, and these all categories change due to the social, temporal context, cultural context of Peru.
Yeah, something I wanted to add to all this conversation, for example, I have been also trying to dig a little bit on authors like I already stated, Pentti Linkola, for example, and Theodore Kacynzki, talking about the industrial society and the future of the industrial society. We do see that there is a big concern regarding us and regarding our, as my boss already explained, the different problems that the industrial society is already having in our more traditional living spaces for indigenous people, for example. But we also see that there is a solution to this problem. We do see that there is a possibility there to expand this and explain better that, for example, try to develop more green energy type of things, green solutions to these things that the supposed greens and leftists, in Europe are always talking about, but they are never implementing. And this is part of the issue is that we talk about the issue is that, for example, what was it? Yeah, is Guillaume Faye in this book, which is why we fight. He also makes that point that all these people are always talking about these issues, but they are never making any progress regarding them. They are not pushing for legislation to these issues. And with us finding these authors that are already speaking about these very accurate points, we can pinpoint some of these new ideas and start seeing them for what they are. They are suggestions to us. They are not going to be the neurological point from where we will develop our ideas, but they are just going to be some avenues that we can use to provide new solutions for today's problems. That's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, for example, Alejandro, I remember that in that aspect, for example, of an archeofuturist approach, I also the deputy director of the Center for Crisolism Studies. The Center for Crisolism Studies is the investigation center that produce all our political theoretical system called Crisolism, no? And investigates, or their investigations are related to this phenomena of the four political theory, no? Due to the work of the Center for Crisolism Studies, we proposed to the Congress of Peru the past year, due to these problems, a law project related to the biocultural rights. That is a new juridical concept that precisely centers the topic between the harmony of these traditions of these communities and equilibrium and a harmony vision of progress. So this is a practical application of the Archeofuturist vision, but in the form of a law project that we do the past year here in Peru.
That's extremely interesting because with what you say about Peru and the various should we say ethnic ingredients which composite Peru as a whole, it does seem like it is the perfect sort of testing ground for a lot of these archaeofuturistic concepts, which can of course through their application almost tailor themselves as they become tried and tested towards a Peruvian identity as such. I just wondered about, because this biocultural legislation is fascinating for me. I wondered if I could ask you about the Amazonian or the Amazonians, the native indigenous tribes people. Do you foresee them in your concept of Peru as being eventually integrating themselves or maintaining their own space almost autonomously?
Okay, yes. We have a very we do a differentiation between three concepts. The concept of pluriculturality, the concept of pluriculturalism, the concept of multiculturalism, and the concept of interculturalism. In Peru, we have a multicultural context between ethnics, various ethnic groups. But these ethnic groups, for example, regarding to the Amazonian point, they, for example, don't want to mix with other ethnic groups. They want to preserve the traditions and the racial identity. That is not the same aspect, for example, between the Andean communities that have already mixed with Creole, or for example, or with the Africans. But for example, in the Amazonian aspect, we have a very strong identity in racial aspect and in cultural aspects. So ethnocultural aspects. So in the case, for example, in the Amazonic communities, they don't want racial mixing. They don't want too much contact with the city. So they want to preserve their identity. No? In the city of Lima, for example, we have more interaction between the ethnic groups. That is not the same aspect in the Amazon, and that is not the same issue in, for example, the Sierra region in Peru. No? There are many different contexts in Peru. So we have in Peru communities that doesn't want to mix racial or cultural, and we have communities that are already mixed, are already relationated and in the cultural and racial aspects. So yes, it's a particular case scenario for a particular region of Peru. For example, the region of the Amazon have a particular issue. The region of Sierra have another particular issue. The region of coast have another particular issue, identity speaking. So we have a clash between indigenism and Hispanism. And that is a clash that is politically manifested between the left, that is indigenous, and the right, that is Hispanist. And that is a clash. And we Chrysalists, we propose, as also Dugin denoted, a synthesis between this cultural aspect that is part of Peru, that is indigenous, but also this Hispanic European ascendance that is also part of Peru. But also with high respect to the particular issues of these communities, because as I also said, are communities of Amazonian communities that doesn't have or doesn't want to mix, and other communities that already mix. So we have a particular issue in each region of Peru, and the political views, for example, the traditional political views of modernity doesn't respect that. Marxism only is indigenist. The right is only Hispanist, and only wants a Catholic or a Hispanic or as Hispanic perception of the reality. Or the other hand, Marxists only have an indigenous perception of the reality, marginating the Hispanic, marginating the Catholics. So the four political theory applied to Peru tries to make a syncretism, a multipolarity that respects each view of each ethnic group of Peru, and that's it.
If I might ask a follow-up question, because this is a point that particularly interested me as well in your description of the Peruvian situation. It seems to me that what you've just described requires a very delicate balance between many conflicting, and in many cases, I imagine, very deeply conflicting points of view. And I mean, at first glance, I can imagine how it might seem that that would be absolutely impossible. The kind of synthesis that you're suggesting in many cases seems to come up against the hard wall of extremely deep and extremely abiding differences between groups that perhaps cannot be bridged, and that perhaps might not even in many cases be able to be set next to one another on any kind of plane of equality, insofar as with some of the particular claims that you've indicated, I can imagine they would at least tend to want a kind of priority of their own position, or a kind of favoring of their particular views over all of the others. Do you think a balance like that is possible in the Peruvian situation? I mean, I'm very curious.
But that's story with Japanese and Chinese population in that time. Yeah.
The great yellow threat. bridge the gap.
And I will say, Alejandro, that this is happening now because the connection point between that and that question is the idea of a second republic and the idea of a new nation that foresees or represents all the ethnic groups in Peru. And that is the idea that is, well, popular today in Peru, the idea of a second republic, of a new nation, of a new state. Well, all ethnic groups are represented, no? And this is a very popular idea now in Peru nowadays. And the principal movement that represents this conception are, well, us. And with the collaboration of the Center for Critical Studies, is like two principal aspects or two points of the matter. No, we have the Center for Critical Studies that supports the theoretical systematization of this new theory, and we have the Jude for the Second Republic, that is the practical application of this theory. No, that if we and I say this new conception of nation, this new conception of republic, this new conception of unity of various ethnic groups and the representation of their particular traditional views in a second new republic is very popular here nowadays in Peru, and it's happening right now.
I can imagine that it would be popular. I mean, it seems to me that Peru at present, from your description, is facing the necessity of coming to terms with this very complex situation. I mean, in my own life, I've had kind of a parallel experience, at least in a very superficial way. I lived for some years in Taos, New Mexico, in the United States. And it has a similar, let's say, grouping of different kinds of ethnicities or people who come from very, very different backgrounds, have very, very different heritages. The majority of the population of that town for the majority of its history has been people who claim to derive directly from the Spanish settlers. They're called Taoseños. They speak a dialect of Spanish, which is very difficult to understand even for fluent Spanish speakers. And then you have the Indians, the Native Americans, the people of the pueblos who live there next to the city, and many of them have continued their traditional lifestyle outside of the city within their pueblo, their city. And I mean, they continue with essentially the traditional ways of keeping up the old building, of making bread, all of these things that have been passed down for just centuries and centuries and centuries, and they're continuing along those lines. Then you have immigrants, particularly from Mexico, who've been coming in, and then of course you've got the Yankees like me who've kind of moved in more and more in recent years, and not everyone's very happy about that. But I mean, even just in that kind of very, very small context, you could see the ways in which, in some cases, there were conflicts that seemed very, very difficult to get around. In other ways, there were points at which people seemed to find a way of living with one another despite extreme differences in lifestyle and things of this sort. And I'm trying to apply that now to a larger scale. I'm trying to imagine that on a national scale, and it seems to me like a very, very difficult proposition. So certainly I wish Peru the best with all of that. In some ways, though, I mean, Europe is facing, in some ways, a similar situation insofar as the European Union is this attempt to unify many different nations which have very, very different heritages as well, and very, very different ways of living, in many cases, very different ways of viewing the world. And the difficulties there, at present, the European Union is essentially an economic unit, right? It's this kind of economic imposition on all of these nations, and it's always had kind of an economic framework. So the difficulties that come to the fore most prominently are naturally the economic. And what's seen in Europe right now, one of the great problems that the European Union is confronting in its attempt to continue existing, is the discrepancy between the economies of, just largely speaking, the South or the East and the economies of the Western Europe or of Central Europe. And there have even been discussions of trying to establish some kind of two-speed economy in order to accommodate for these very, very vast differences. But it's also hard to see exactly how those differences could be accommodated, and they cause real and immediate problems in many geographical portions of the country. And so, I'm also trying to apply this to a kind of Peruvian situation that you're describing. I'm sure that there are similar problems in Peru in terms of regional discrepancies between the economic earnings of one part, the economic earnings of another part, the necessity of imposing some kind of overarching legal structure on the entire country such that there's a degree of fairness, there's a degree of equality before the law, which I think would be an absolutely necessary stipulation for any kind of order that you've described between this sort of an equality between these different ethnic or social groups. And that attempt to put a kind of overarching law, a kind of overarching economic order over all the different parts of the country, I imagine that also results in some, perhaps in many cases, unexpected difficulties as well in attempting to navigate all of these differences.
Definitely, it does. Yeah, because, for example, we have, like my boss was explaining, there is this. There is this, the main activity, the main is the main industry that produces money, GDP, all this economic growth, and all this is basically mining. But at the same time, this mining exploitation of our resources do not reflect the income that the people that live around that area actually win from this activity. So there is always this, and there is always this theorization by the left mainly, that all this money is sent to the capital. It's somewhat sent to the people living here, but we also don't see a dime of that. So you see that there is this misconception of one place, and the academia that is mainly Marxist to an extent. It has been very influential over there. They have been overly exploiting this type of view, this type of rationalization of this problem. But the problem is that this money does not go into the capital and to us; it goes outside. So it's a similar situation within Europe, as we are seeing today within France, for example.
Yes, for example, we have bad public transport, bad system justice, bad health system. So this economic growth that is only GDP, is no reflected in a real progress of the socioeconomic welfare of society. Is only represented or directed to the welfare of oligarchy. And that is the principal reason that leads to the appearance of this new theoretical system in Peru. This reaction to this context, this reaction of the failure of political theories, this reaction to the failure of governments to fight against corruption, to fight against disobedience, legal disobedience, to fight against disorder in society. And this failure is general. And all Peruvians need to know that this failure is general. This first republic is all that was founded in 1821 is a total failure, or it's already breaking in a breaking point. And we need a new one. We need a new political system. We need a new political system, a new political structure, a new political theory, a new political economic system. And that is the principal aspect that leads to the appearance of Crisolism in the ways of the four political theory of Alexander Dugin. And that is but obviously Crisolism is not a copy of four political theory as Alexander Dugin. Crisolism have as I also explained, his particular views between or his particular views for this very difficult Peruvian context of ethnic groups, of ethnic interest, of ethnic relations. So that is the principal reason that the four principal theses or four principal aspects of Crisolism is neo-structuralism, is a neo-structuralism view, authentic nationalism, authentic democracy, but is a democracy, is an illiberal democracy. That is a conception that is very today, in these days. An authentic democracy related to a meritocracy and a new Peruvian ontology. These four aspects, the neo-structuralist view, the authentic nationalism, that is ethnic, and the authentic democracy, that is a meritocratic one, and a new Peruvian ontology based principally in a new concept of Peruvian. We have a differentiation between stages of consciousness of Peruvianness. For example, we have Peruvians that don't are conscious of their Hispanic ascendance, for example, or they are not conscious of their indigenous ascendance. And there comes the alienation. The alienation, for example, that Peruvians that are indigenous are commencing to start to act like Creoles or like Europeans, or Europeans that are alienated between indigenous conceptions and commence acting like indigenous. And they go to Amazonian communities and they get killed because there is not their cultural framework. So we have the alienation, a process of alienation. So Crisolism has generated a new Peruvian ontology to explain that process, to explain that situation, and to overcome this situation of particular difficultness. And well, that is the principal aspects of Crisolism and the relevance of the four political theory here in Peru to overcome that situation.
Alexander Dugin is exceptionally good at opening up the space for having conversations of this kind, for having thoughts of this kind, for attempting to break out of the prior way of viewing things. And I think that's one of the great values of reading his work, because it does permit one to step outside of these kinds of faux traditionalistic structures that we're all living within, and that all of us to some extent are informed by, in many cases indoctrinated by. And I think that's one of the reasons why the sort of thought that you're proposing is absolutely so necessary in our time. What's interesting about our time is that it's becoming widely apparent to people that this necessity exists. One sees this reflected even in our language, the degree to which we speak about the need for something new, something untried. Neoliberalism, neoconservatism, reactionaryism, even things like the alt-right, right, the alternative right, the new right. All of these terms indicate that there's this movement towards something which hasn't been done before, which also, again, points emphatically back to the fact that we are existing in systems that have come hard a cropper of their internal difficulties, and they're unable to get past that point. They're unable to get past the problems that they themselves have produced. Many things you describe actually seem to me to hold relatively true even where I am in Italy, particularly with the advent of the latest government, the Salvini government here in Italy. I mean, many of the things that were said before Salvini's arrival to have been absolutely impossible, Salvini has done, and he's done so with some success. But I mean, obviously immigration, trying to stop immigration, that was said to be impossible before Salvini came, and he simply did it. But on the economic scale as well, right now one of the great topics here in Italy is the so-called spread, which is the difference between the GDP of Germany with respect to the GDP of Italy. And it's grown much more acute since Salvini stepped into the government in consequence of the economic policies that he has put in place. And what's interesting about this is that everyone right now is up in arms about this. They're saying that it's going to cause severe economic crises. It's going to cause all kinds of handicaps to Italy, et cetera, by all of the existing, the accepted knowledge. What he's doing right now should be very, very dangerous for the economy, but it's actually resulting in many benefits for the Italian people. So far, the economy has failed to collapse as the globalists seem to think that it should. And this, again, just indicates that the so-called tried and true, the sort of liberal order under which we're all living, is not adequate. It's no longer adequate to the problems that are confronting us. We have to be able to step beyond that. We have to be able to challenge that and to do things that, according to that view, might even be dangerous, might even be, in many cases, according to that view, they might be catastrophic, because it's clear that the people who actually control these systems are not really interested in, the benefit of the people who they claim to be interested in. If I understand the situation correctly there in Peru, it's something equivalent to this mining situation that you have, where mining seems to be a staple of the Peruvian economy, but the benefits of this staple of the Peruvian economy don't seem to be arriving to the miners themselves to the degree to which one might hope. And this sort of thing is seen throughout our economies nowadays. Unfortunately, the people who attempt to describe these economies are putting a very specific spin on their interpretation of what's actually happening. And they're able to do so through this kind of sophisticated numbers game, which focuses very often on imaginary numbers. It focuses on things like the GDP. It focuses on things that really, by any rational standard, should not have the importance that they do have in our present world. And so to that extent, it's encouraging to see the opening of new space for debate, new space for theory, new space for ideas that have not been tried or that have not been tested. But again, we're facing the necessity of coming to terms with these things. And the Peruvian situation, I think, is just an exemplary test case for this kind of thing, for the necessity of attempting to come to some sort of new idea about how to govern local regions that are vastly different between themselves.
And that's why, for example, we are doing a recategorization or a redefinition of categories in terms of the four political theory, in terms of Crisolism, for example. We are in Crisolism, we believe, for example, a concept of a new nationalism. We have this in Europe too, this populism reaction, this nationalist reaction, this nationalist rebirth in France, in Europe in general. But the nationalist thought never have been summarized in principal aspects. Never has been a doctrine, a structure. It has been always a practical political view. So we have in the Center for Critical Studies, we are working in a pure theory of nationalism.
Interesting.
On the principal thesis that nationalism, since 1789, is a doctrinal proposal that is transversal to all political theories. It was in liberalism, it was in communism, it was in fascism, and that is the principal power of nationalism. Nationalism is transversal to all political theories. And that is the principal reason that nationalism never will die. Nationalism is the principal power of the people. And that is the principal aspect or the principal reason why nationalism is always overcomes political ideologies in the strict term of the word, no? And for example, we determine that all these ideologies, liberalism, communism, and fascism, they are in their nationalist points of view that these ideologies have. There are points that there are common points. For example, there there is an ontological conception of nation and fatherland. There is a recognition, a recognition of the recognition of the national unity and the welfare of the social being. There is an exaltation of national identity. There is an exaltation of military values and civic patriotic virtues. There is a concept of independence, a concept of autosufficiency, and a concept of auto-defense. That is the principal transversal concept of all nationalisms. All nationalisms in all political theories have these points of connection. So this is the principal aspects of a pure theory of nationalism, a nationalism that needs to be redefined in terms of four political theory, a nationalism that is essential, fundamental to all, transversal to all political conceptions. And that is why nationalism is the first political force against globalization. And nationalism will never die for that reason, because nationalism is a phenomena of the peoples.
This is a fascinating idea that you're involved in here, Israel. My compliments as well for this. I'll be very interested in following this. It leads me to something that I see as one of the great problems confronting what we might generally call the dissident right today, just for lack of a better word, for lack of a more inclusive word. Nationalism might even be a more appropriate word, for all of the nationalist groups today. We are at a moment at which conservatism seems to be dying, conservatism as it has existed in the very recent past. And I think an account can easily be given for this. Conservatism has always been a kind of locally based affair. It is focused on the here and now in very, very small areas. The kinds of local traditions have been the fount of the vigor and vitality of conservatism. But this has made it impossible for conservatism to actually put up a unified front against the forces that would destroy the very things that it attempted to conserve. Liberalism has been much more effective in this, insofar as liberalism has been able to put up a unified front. It has been able to simply bulldoze down all of these small differences in many parts of the world through the force of its kind of ecumenical or universal aspects. And in consequence of that, it has been more powerful than conservatism. And the proof of that is simply in the fact that today we are, all of us, practically speaking, living in areas where conservatism is no longer a viable option, or at least not a viable option in the same way that it was several decades ago. So the reaction to that definitely seems to demand something exactly like what you're talking about, this kind of establishment of an ideology which is capable of actually confronting liberalism with the same sort of universality, with the same sort of grand sweeping vision, which is capable of uniting the disparate parts of the globe even against this kind of unified threat to all of their local ways of living. Nationalism seems to be a natural place to go for that, because it expresses, even in its very name, this kind of focus on the nation, this focus on smaller units than a sort of liberalized global order. But it confronts the same problem as conservatism, I think, insofar as it is an attempt to preserve local traditions, local ways of being, which are easily overthrown, easily crushed by this juggernaut of liberalism. But how can you do that if these local ways of being are fundamentally conflictual in some sense with other local ways of being in other parts of the globe? I mean, I think one response to this is simply to say, well, it would establish these nations that then are content to exist on their own terms in their own space, and they all have their own ways of being. But the problem there, I think, is even reflected to some extent in one of the points that you indicated as part of the essence of nationalism, which is this kind of focus on militarism, this focus on the martial virtues. But that implies as well that there are enemies to fight. And that implies as well that your neighbor might be one of those enemies to fight. And it implies that your ways of life might come into conflict with other ways of life, and you might have to defend them. Which implies that, nationalism as a kind of overarching structure, as a kind of ideology for all of the different nations, might establish a context in which those nations can no longer coexist with one another, and it might establish a context in which they come to blows with one another. I mean, this is something similar to what I was saying about the Peruvian situation. You've got these very, very different and very even contradictory, even profoundly contradictory ways of life. So how can you find a way of establishing a sort of unity between them? What do you think about that? I mean, I think that this is surely something that any kind of ideology of nationalism has to come to terms with.
Because a principal and neuralgic point to nationalism, because that's the way, or that's the reason why nationalism or new contemporary nationalism can be contradictory to internationalism. Internationalism needs nationalism to exist, and that's an idea. That is an idea that is revalorated for a particular thought that is, I think, King Il Sung say that. I think that the Hooch idea. The Hooch idea represents a balance between nationalism and internationalism, and that in that aspect we can, for example, how do you say rescatar, revalue,
rescue.
How is it? Rescue this aspect of, because we don't have nothing to do with Marxist-Leninism, but this is an interesting point that we can rescue. New contemporary nationalism hasn't to be contradictory to internationalism. True internationalism is the recognition of the existence of nationalisms. No, it's the recognition of the existence of multipolarity. And multipolarity needs precisely the dialogue between nations, the dialogue between ethnic groups, the dialogue between different points of view. And that is the principal aspect of multipolarity. And multipolarity, and a real one, is there is not, as I say, the old contradiction between nationalism and internationalism that was put by Trotsky, that all the world hates Trotsky.
A universally loathed figure.
I know that hate Trotsky, and Trotsky is the principal responsible for that internationalism that is against nationalism. But now in contemporary world, nationalism hasn't to be more any contradictory with internationalism. Internationalism needs nationalism to exist, because even in semantic words, internationalism, nationalism, the existence of nations, the existence of differences, multipolarity.
Yeah, something I have to add to all this conversation about what you were saying, John, about who is the enemy. I believe I have the right book this is Henry Kissinger's World Order. So Henry Kissinger himself describes, the many big spaces that exist that propose a new model of a world order. But his idea, his proposal is unipolarity. Is who is the one that is going to lead the world in this case scenario? And he describes many places. He describes the United States. He describes Asia, the Middle East, Europe, Russia, and also a little bit of India as well, to a point, to a certain extent. But the big opportunity over here is that he's not describing two other main lands, which is Central and South America, or what you call sometimes Latin America. Of course, we call it Ibero-America for different reasons. But in any case, this group, and the other group will be Africa. Well, of course, Africa right now is totally destroyed. There is no one in Africa that can prove a contestant against this world order as he's describing. He's describing basically the neoliberal world order. So it's to the point of who we are going to defend and protect against. We have the answer right here. He describes himself, and furthermore he says that we are heading to an Asian world order. He is describing his leanings with China. He's trying to bridge the gap between China and different other powers, like for example Israel or maybe India to a point. So this is the. I believe he already explained who the possible enemy can be in the future. So why do we need a military? Why do we need to defend ourselves? And furthermore, we don't want to fall into the I would say the ultra-nationalism of the Balkans, because did this what you were describing already happened within the Balkan War, in the War of
Yes, it did.
Balkans, yeah, within Yugoslavia. But this is a I don't want to throw this term right about right around the bus, but what happened over there is that this autistic nationalism. That's how I call it, because before Yugoslavia was a
It's a good term, Zero.
yeah, Yugoslavia was a power that can actually contest with the United States, both and the USSR, and also Nicolae Ceausescu pointed this as well, that these people were able to hold this as to assert themselves in the world order with the non-aligned movement. We already saw that. So there is this possibility, but they fell to the autistic nationalism, that they started to skirmish between one another. And what do they have now? They are all slaves to the EU, and you see there is a lot of Croatian people that say that are so proudful. We are done with the communists. We are done with Yugoslavia. But you are now you have another totalitarianism happening right now. So why are you are proud of what exactly? What did you accomplish?
Precisely the theoretical systematization of nationalism has to be related that nationalism is not chauvinism, is not jingoism. The real nationalism as a theoretical system, as a theoretical systematization, is not autistic exaltation. It's a healthy exaltation of national identity. And this healthy exaltation of national identity has to accept that there are other nations that also have a healthy exaltation of national identity. And we return to the point that we are discussing already, the harmony between nationalism and internationalism. Because the exaltation of national identity, it has to be healthy. The exaltation of the civic virtues or
Values.
Or the military virtues have to be healthy, because we have to recognize that there are other nations that also have these virtues, and we have to recognize them. That is the new nationalism. The new nationalism that is not contradictory with internationalism, and a new nationalism that also is not contradictory with ambientalism. Ambientalism is precisely the security of the sovereignty of a particular nation in aspects of natural comprehension. The comprehension of the space that we have to ensure our generations. So we have two aspects: ambientalism and internationalism as a new political concepts, as a new political categories of this new contemporary nationalism.
I'm curious about the internationalist aspect of this of this theory. It seems to me that something like international law is wanted in a case like this. If not international law, then at least, let's say, international conventions, such that any offender to, let's say, the worldwide peace, or any country that goes too far in the destruction of the environment, to take your latest point, might receive sanctions of some kind. And I mean, one of the great trends of modernity seems to be toward the production of greater and greater, larger and larger political units. This has been primarily on the back of liberalism, which is itself a theory dedicated toward a kind of universality of opinion about the way politics should be run. And it lends itself very easily, if it does not seek to culminate in a single world order, a homogeneous world state. Obviously, nationalism would stand opposed to that in its very principle. I mean, it indicates, again, directly from the title itself, that it insists upon the dignity of the nation. Nonetheless, taking China as a fantastic example of some of the difficulties with a view like this. I mean, China is a nation. It presumably has its nationalist instincts, just as any other nation does. In many cases, I think much stronger than most of our countries should have. This leads it to a number of points of conflict with the rest of the globe, and it certainly leads it to a kind of just abhorrent degradation of its internal environment, to the point that it's capable of creating problems on a global scale, even just environmentally speaking. Now, it seems clear that in any kind of multipolar world, there will always be one of the poles that seeks supremacy, that seeks hegemony, that seeks a kind of more global control, or at least that potentiality always exists. So what sorts of mechanisms or structures or power considerations do you foresee as a means of attempting to delimit those powers in a kind of multipolar world, or a kind of a world that has adopted this sort of nationalistic ideology?
Well, first one, the principal idea that Crisolism proposes for that, for the geopolitical aspect, is the conformation of a confederation of South American countries to put, to form a geopolitical space, as we also or always say, like a great fatherland, a patria grande, no? And to ensure that we have the
sovereignty, survival,
the sufficient power to respond to any international aggression, because war is a fact. That is Carl Schmitt. War is a fact, and and we have South Americans. South Americans have this also geopolitical space, vital geopolitical space, and Crisolism proposed the conformation of a union, a South American Union, free confederation of nations.
Yeah, we will achieve what the South tried a lot of years ago. The United States, you know.
We have terms we have UNASUR, we have Comunidad Americana de Naciones, we have like models that are copies of European Union, but total failure, because they are only related to economic aspects and not identity or.
Judging by the way the European Union has gone, you should probably bless your stars that they've been a failure, but nonetheless.
Yes.
But yeah, I think that's necessary. I mean, this kind of future of geopolitical blocks, I think, is an absolutely necessary part of any kind of geopolitical analysis which attempts to establish a multipolarity in the world. And I think it's the same thing in many cases, which is behind this kind of urging of the development of a unified Europe. Obviously, in the actual implementation of the European Union, most of the forces that have been involved have been, unfortunately, primarily economic. They've been money-seeking in many cases. The European Union also has this very curious history in which it sort of developed around this kind of absolute horror of Germany and of what Germany might do in the future. And so, when all of these peculiarities aside, there have also been many, many individuals in European history who have pushed for a kind of European Union, perceiving that a unified Europe would be geopolitically stable or would be culturally rich, or any number of different and alternative routes for Europe as a unified whole. Martin and I have a long ongoing conversation about Europe and exactly what it is and what the nature and the value of a unified Europe might be. One of the great compelling arguments for a unified Europe is the geopolitical argument. Europe as this kind of fragmented composite of 20 to 30 odd nations does not have any sort of geopolitical weight. It certainly does not have the power to defend itself from the great monsters that are abroad, particularly if they decide to look upon it with hungrier eyes than they have done so far. And in many cases, it also becomes easy prey for the kind of economic or cultural manipulations that we see right now from the United States in particular, although the European Union is not particularly better at defending Europe against those. But nonetheless, I mean, this sort of argument that Europe has to form a composite whole, it has to form a unified whole in order to, in some ways, defend itself against these threats, is a very compelling argument. At the same time, I mean, the other side of it, which I think Martin will certainly have something to say about, is that you tend to lose the particularities, the richness of the texture of Europe when you try to impose this kind of unity on it, even in a sort of federation of nations, which the European Union is emphatically not. But even in that kind of a federation, there's a degree to which you're tending toward this convergence of mores, this convergence of ways of living, this convergence even of languages in many cases, and toward corresponding impoverishment of local diversity and local richness, which I think is a terrible price to pay in many cases, although it might be a necessary one.
Yeah.
For example,
I want.
For example, we have in South America, we have 12 countries: Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname, Ecuador, Peru, Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina. And the principal problem we have, for example, Argentina and Chile. Well, Chile have a eternal problem with Peru. We don't know why. Well, there are a lot of factors. And for example, Argentina believe that is the Europe of America, and also Chile, and also Paraguay, because they have more communities of European descendants. That is true. No, and then we have Colombia, we have Peru, we have Ecuador that are more indigenous, more related to the Cordillera de los Andes, to the Andes, no? And the principal aspect to take care or to take importance in this is if a confederation of free nations will be established. There are not going to be like a single currency or something like that. Each nations will have to have the own legitimacy, the own currency. There is not a kind of type of like the European Union, the Euro thing or something like that, because that proves that it's very dangerous to extend on the all economic system without considering the differentiating points of each nation. You know? So this is applied to South America. In South America, we have all different contexts, all different situations, and I think the structure of a federation or a confederation is more effective that thing called Europe Union or that model.
Yeah, something I have to add to this conversation is that, for example, me and my boss, I was talking to him about, for example, what would it be the heartland of South America, and we have been kind of theorizing that it might not just be one heartland, it might be three, and these three heartlands might be the Andes Mountains, the Andes mountain range that happens to could be the other one would be the Amazon jungle, and the other one would be the Patagonia thing. But this could even if we talk about an inner multipolarity, we have a multipolarity of heartlands. So it's complicated to see just one nation as the leader of all the other nations. So to us it's more plausible because of this geographical situation even to have.
We will have Lima, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, or Cusco, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, or something like that.
And to have absolutely that's the idea, to have these three main groups, but also there are other groups, like for example like we were saying, Colombia also possess a little bit of that Amazon jungle, and they also have interesting thinkers, like for example Nicolas Gomez Davila. I believe you might have read a little bit of him, because I have seen that a lot of when I was in Europe last year, I saw some stickers by Generation Identity from Austria that they had phrases of Nicolas Gomez Davila on the stickers. So
I'm amazed how often he shows up in our books. Actually, he's quoted in almost every one of our books that I edit these days. So yeah.
Yeah, there you see. But I wanted to ask you, if we go about the thesis of the heartlands, I believe, Martin, you are British, isn't it correct?
Yes. Yes.
How do you see this happening? I mean, would Britain also have its own heartland, or would it be a shared heartland? And what are your thoughts on, for example, we much later on. This is the other question that I wanted to ask you. Much later on the conversation, that we were talking about our path for the Peruvian identitarians would be, it's a dual path. We have a metapolitical movement, but we also have as well a political movement. So all this energy is not siphoned by these political already established political parties. It's siphoned to us directly. So we are going to redirect all these efforts into more pushing more different legislations. Maybe have small elections to a point. No, we are already discussing these issues, but that's our point. But for example, I have been seeing around Europe, the identitarian movement, other organizations, but they all, I don't understand why they all trust their politicians. They already established political parties. Is that I wanted to have your take on these two questions. The heartland question and the political establishment parties question.
Well, the heartland question, I mean, in relation to Britain, it's a very particular example, because the relation between Britain and Europe, for example, if we were talking about a unified Europe in some manner, Britain has never considered itself European. It's always the continent, across the water. It's never felt itself particularly European, which is very surprising when you consider all the people shouting about Remain and Stop Brexit. We're all Europeans. Britain has never been European. And actually it's had some rather unpleasant things to say about about Europe for many years. So in terms of a heartland, with regard to the European question, it's incredibly difficult to say, because, as John was talking about, the difference even between the North and the South, which is a very generalized sort of division, but there's a huge difference when you see the national characters, for example, even something as intangible as that. The difference between national characters and attitudes between the North and the South means that if one was to have one heartland, for example, within Europe, this would make it very, very difficult. It might be actually that the solution you're proposing for South America, we have multiplicity of heartlands, would function quite well in Europe too, albeit within a much smaller geographical space. So the European heartland in relation to Britain, it doesn't really exist, because Britain is its own heartland. It's so small that it can be its own heartland. But with regard to Europe, it's very difficult to say. It may end up being simply that each nation is its own heartland, in a sense, because it's such a small geographical territory, really, when you compare to, say, South America or the United States. So I don't see necessarily in Europe the need for a heartland, because I think each country considers itself to be its own heartland in a way, especially when you consider that whatever the pro-European Union people say, if you ask anyone, really, they'll say, especially if you go to, say, France or Italy, they will give their region first as their principal identity, folled by their country.
Maybe even their town first.
Exactly. Hyper kind of minuscule identities. The concept of European doesn't really count in a day-to-day sense. So what was the other question? I've gone rambling a bit with.
No, it's okay. The other question was regarding, this identitarian activism, but all of this energy is siphoned by the political parties already established, and they don't do exactly what the identitarians would do, and this is is our main difference. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it is a very curious thing that we keep the many identitarian movements and many nationalist movements, especially within Europe, keep putting their faith in the system, in that they believe that through electoral successes they can change things radically. And of course, we have examples, for example, like with Salvini, who is certainly more more along the nationalist path than other politicians, and certainly has made some impact. But you're struggling against, especially whilst the European Union exists, any identitarian politician is struggling against such a vast machine that is designed specifically to prevent such a thing happening. Even to the extent, I believe, was it in Austria, they were told the election was told to vote again because a nationalist politician did very well. The European Union forced the country to vote again. And then there was it in Holland? There was, or in Belgium, there was the Green candidate and the nationalist candidate. And I think the nationalist candidate just edged through. And then the European Union demanded a reinvestigation and reopened the voting because they said there was alleged fraud in the voting. You see this on a number of levels with the European Union, in which it forces politicians to either obey and toe the line, or they'll just demand that country revotes until it gets the result that it wants. So it's a very curious phenomenon that we keep putting our faith in electoral success in some manner. But I wonder as well if this question hasn't really been delved into in any meaningful sense within many identitarian movements, because there hasn't been a great question of how to achieve anything in a meaningful sense without using the ballot box. One reason for this potentially is also if you start going into the streets and doing actions and that kind of thing, you're opening yourself up to a huge attack from the political system, from the media, and from anything that could essentially make you lose your job, distance yourself from your family, and all these aspects. The stigma on identitarianism within Europe, within many Western countries, is so strong that and even the concept of patriotism, the stigma against in many countries in Europe is so strong that almost the only way in which you can go about anything safely is to try and do it politically, because then that lessens the impact on you personally. But again, it's such a strange concept that you would keep putting your faith in this very much outmoded, rickety system to gain your goals when evidently everything is so highly stacked against you it can't possibly function. Bit depressing.
But it's also a very realistic assessment of the state of affairs at present. To some extent, I think people do just continue to return to the standing political order, attempting to change things through the resources or the tools that are given to them, simply because it is the easiest way of attempting to affect change. It's the most obvious way of attempting to affect change. It's also in many cases just the most convenient way of attempting to affect change, because as you point out, Martin, you're still to some extent existing within the safety of this system, this kind of husk that's been built around us. And so you're able to attempt to move in a direction that pleases you, or at least to pretend like you're doing your part in that battle, while not really discommoding yourself. You're not putting yourself in any danger. You're not facing the necessity of radically changing your way of living or anything like this. And I think in Western countries in particular, all of us are, at the end of the day, very, very pampered. By historical standards, certainly we are very, very pampered. And so it's easy to fall into these sorts of set ruts. It's one of the real challenges facing, I think, the Western world, that we're all so used to simply abiding by the standing laws, because the standing laws for such a long time have more or less favored us, that when they start to actually turn against us, we're not even aware of it, and we're not in any kind of a psychological state to do anything real about it. The revolutionary fervor or the revolutionary attitude in Europe is nil, practically speaking, and has been since the fall of communism, I should say. So, I think that's a large part of it as well, just this kind of the ease of it, the simple ease of doing your part through the voting box, even though you might recognize on some level that the chances of it resulting in any kinds of change are very, very, very small. And then at the same time, I think there have been a number of results from the ballot box that have suggested to people that maybe it's not quite so hopeless as it would seem. And I think that, a number of kind of watershed moments even in the past few years, such as the election of Donald Trump in Italy, in the United States, the election of Salvini in Italy, Brexit as well for people who are just staunchly opposed to the European Union and want to do anything to kind of, poke it in the eye. All of these things have represented in some way a moment at which it has seemed at least that parliamentary procedure has resulted in some kind of move against the system or a move away from the system. And that has promoted this sort of activity within Europe, because if it can be done in one part of Europe, maybe it can be done in another part of Europe, or the same thing in the United States. If a Donald Trump can arrive once, even if he's largely neutralized by the powers that be, who knows, maybe the next, quote unquote, Donald Trump will be in some ways liberated of Donald Trump's particular shackles, and he'll be able to do what Donald Trump failed to do. But all of these movements, they suggest some kind of hope through the working of the system.
Yeah, we are all in that way. We are all, as Argentinian philosopher Alberto Buela say, we are dissidents of the system, and we have to construct alternatives to confront that system, the globalization and the principal trichotomy, the individualism, capitalism, and liberal democracy. That is the principal trichotomy of globalization. Globalization wants to, by force, implant this trichotomy: individualism, capitalism, liberal capitalism, and liberal democracy. And that is, for example, the principal contradiction between the theory of dissent and the theory of the communicative action of Habermas. Habermas is an enemy of Alberto Buela. Alberto Buela is an Argentinian philosopher that proposes the theory of dissent. The principal aspect of communication is that if you don't have the possibility to dissent, the dialogue is already settled, and that it happens with the critique of the communicative action of Habermas, because Habermas is centered only in the dialogue, but not in the dissent. But Alberto Buela, for example, is centered in the term of the dissent, that the principal aspect of communication is the possibility to dissent, to the possibility to contradict, the possibility to dialogue in base a dissident position, and that is the aspect that does not complain or integrated in the communicative action theory of Habermas. No. And well, Habermas is part of the Frankfurt School, and we know all the roots of that school of thought. And for our side, there is this theory of dissent, and we are all dissidents in that aspect.
There's the possibility of being dissidents in our day in a way that I think there hasn't been, at least in the recent past. And again, I think that this is due to the sort of opening up of a vacuum within the political theory of our day more than anything else. There's not yet a political vacuum as such, but in the political theory of our time, there's a vacuum. And I mean, to this extent, it does seem to me that we are living in blessed days insofar as all of the great theoretically rich moments, particularly in Western history, have come from these times in which there's a kind of geopolitical opening. There's this point at which things are no longer certain any longer. There's an instability in the very fundament of the societies. This happened during the time of the Greeks with the invasion of Persia and this kind of conflictuality between Sparta and Athens. It happened during the Renaissance with this, very fertile peninsula of Italy, which was just assaulted on all sides by these enormous powers outside of it, and even internally was very, very confused and politically uncertain. There come these moments, throughout our history in which there's this opening of an unexpected space in which one can suddenly ask questions that previously were not asked very regularly, certainly, because things were stabler and it was normal for people to just sort of take for granted the state of affairs. And it took a very exceptional kind of person to try to step beyond that. Nowadays, it's becoming increasingly normal to try to step beyond that, because it's clear that that space is no longer, a safe space, to use a term beloved of the university system, at least nowadays. It's no longer a space in which one can exist unambiguously or without forming these kinds of questions. We are, all of us, to some extent, forced to confront basic issues in a way that was not true in most parts of the West, certainly, at least 20 or 30 years ago. The situation in South America might be radically different, and I just don't know enough about it to comment. But in the West, at least, it seems to me that we've come to a moment at which it is now possible again to begin confronting the questions that really formulate the basis of society, where we're coming to a point at which we can actually begin to theorize in a way that was not so easy, certainly, in the recent past. And it's leading to a kind of ferment. It's leading to a ferment of opinions. It's leading to a ferment of ideas. It's leading to things exactly like this nationalistic ideology that you've been proposing during the course of this podcast, Israel. All of these things are providing us the possibility to begin really asking profound questions about the nature of society, the nature of government. And to that extent, I think we really are living in marvelous times. Obviously, that doesn't prohibit or preclude the possibility of our economic system collapsing tomorrow and leading to worldwide devastation, or the possibility of nuclear warfare, or any of these other delightful opportunities that open up to us moderns. But nonetheless, I think that aspect of our situation has to be regarded with a great deal of gratitude, this degree to which we can actually see things with clarity, or at least with an openness that was not accessible perhaps to our fathers or our forefathers.
Yes, talking about the openness, because here in, for example, South America and in Peru specifically, we have the total failure of traditionalists, of classic traditionalists and classic conservatives. And these positions of conservatism is also represented in the left. We have Marxists that they are not producing anything or new products of Marxism, of interpretation of Marxism adapted to a new contemporary context in Peru. They are keep reading Mariátegui, that is an author of 1920s of Peru. They are keep interpreting reality between a vision of 1920 Marxism. So they are conservatives in this aspect. So the conservatism is also in the right, is also in the left. But it's a conservatism not revolutionary. It's a conservatism that is reactionary, that only wants to preserve things that was without any difference if these positions are good or bad. For example, classical traditionalism and classical traditionalism, for instance, wants to go back to the viceroyals of Peru, wants to go back to the caste systems. When you have, for example, Creoles, we have many categories for classes. No, we have Creoles, we have indigenous ascendants, and we have the castizos, the mestizos, the saltapatra, categories of mixed.
Yeah, the other ones are like,
and they have their spaces, and they have like their spaces of living, and they cannot cross the other spaces of living of the other castes. So there are classical traditionalists that want to go back to them because they relationated the political problem of Peru as a racial problem. They think that the idea of modernity, of progress, is related. They are also infected with a liberal way of thinking, because they think that the indigenous folks, the indigenous people, are some certain of obstacle to progress, and that's a typical liberal thinking of a way of thinking, no? And so and some traditionalists, classic traditionalists, have degenerate or have become reactionary. No, and in the Marxist view, they continue reading Mariatti or authors in the
20s.
principal aspects of industrial revolution. So we are ready in Peruvian society another total different context of that interpretation. So that is the principal problem with political theories here in Peru. The problem with the political theories that are reactionary or that are supposedly respond to liberalism. No, we have the problem with these theories that they are a total failure because they keeping interpreting reality in terms of the past of already past categories of these doctrines.
Yeah, and it's not only that, it's that they also have this drive to, for example, in the case of academia is basically, over here is basically Marxism. If you're going to go to academia, you're going to have a Marxist view. It's already pre-established. And the difference with, I wouldn't have a problem if they would start reading, for example, Ernst Niekisch, or people like, or Dugin or something, something, or Ceausescu, something that provides a new worldview, new ideas, or that are even closer to the reality that we are living in right now. But the problem is that they are always reading Rosa Luxemburg. They are reading Lenin again, for the 100th time. It's like, for example, all these.
They don't read anything else.
Yeah, yeah, and if they read something, more groundbreaking, like, for example, Gaddafi, they are saying, we also like to read philo-fascist thinkers like Gaddafi. And it's like, bro,
The Marxists have become conservatives, haven't they?
Yeah.
They've become conservative Marxists. It's a very
Yeah.
curious kind of development.
Yeah, it's too weird. So, for example, for us, the path would be to start injecting these ideas in the academian side of things, and for that we might need students as well as teachers that are willing and are open to new ideas. To, for example, nobody in Peru, basically not many, in the academia, not many people know who Guillaume Faye is or who Alain de Benoist is. This is a problem. We need to change the chip, in a matter of speaking. And not only that, we also need to have these other organizations that already exist, like syndicates, like student collectives, to have this drive for them to start thinking in these new categories, so they can generate new ideas and transform reality with these new ideas. But if they are always thinking on the proletariat and all these type of things, they are losing too much to this, to liberalism itself, that they say that they are combating against. So this is the real challenge for us. But to a point, we have been type of recruiting to an extent people that were heavily Marxist, and they are already starting to think in these new categories. They are asking new questions. So it is not impossible for us. It is already happening to a minimum level, because we don't have budget. We don't have. We lack a lot of things, but what we don't lack is spirit and ideas.
That's already much. That's already very much, I should say. And I think one of the great challenges facing us now is to think exactly along the lines that you were proposing, together with this awareness of the fact that the status quo is breaking apart at very interesting and important points, and that we can take advantage of that. And just to name, I think, two of the ways in which this is happening, which you yourself have touched upon and what you were just saying, Zero. In the first place, the left-right political spectrum is coming apart. It's no longer valid, it's no longer adequate in any number of different cases, and people are perceiving the inadequacy of it, and the fact that it is no longer this kind of spectrum which encompasses all possible political viewpoints. It is rather a kind of political straitjacket in which you are forced to adopt certain positions that maybe you have absolutely nothing to do with simply because you fall on the left or simply because you fall on the right. This spectrum coming apart and fragmenting into pieces, it might seem like simply a question of the words that we use or a linguistic issue. But in fact, it's actually much deeper than that, because if the spectrum no longer holds, then it is essentially possible to make connections with individuals who, might in a prior generation have been considered Marxists, or might in a prior generation have been considered fascists. These very, very different worldviews that no longer really have any applicability to the state of affairs in which we're living now might be able to find common ground in a completely different context, a completely different framework. And this opens up the possibility of establishing connections and establishing alliances that do not seem possible simply because we have been led to think in a certain very structured and inadequate way about the differences between political positions. So I think that's one way in which we need to begin to think exactly along the lines that have been proposed during the course of this podcast, in a way that is transcendent of these outdated forms that we have been given. And then another respect in which this is true, I think, is the question of academia. You're absolutely right, Zero, that many of the books that Arktos publishes certainly never will see a classroom in most mainstream academic institutions. And to a certain extent, I think it's also just kind of futile to hope that they ever will, because these institutions are just so corrupt in many cases. In other cases, they're just so infused and infected with a certain very, very liberal worldview that breaching through this kind of impenetrable carapace that they developed around them is no longer a possibility. At the same time, with the decay of the institutions that are presently in place, these academic institutions themselves will cease to be viable in the way that they have been in the past. One sees this in the United States, for example, with the exorbitant cost of education, the degree to which that education is no longer paying dividends, even in terms of preparing people to be able to discuss things intellectually. Many of these institutions that just put enormous debt on your back are no longer sensible. They're no longer sensible investments, and many people are realizing that. Many young people are realizing that. The same thing can be said, I think, as well for Europe in many cases for different reasons. But the point being that the decay of these institutions opens up new possibilities for the production of new forms of education that have long since been forgotten, like the traditional schools, which were in the past, European past, were not associated with institutions per se, but in many cases formed around figureheads, formed around philosophers. One sees this around Dugin, I think, in many cases, that he kind of has this grouping of pupils around him that take a lot from his ideas and are willing to discuss new possibilities with one another. And these are the places that I think we have to be looking for in a future kind of a new academy or something of this sort. Yeah. So I mean, in general, we can say the modernity seems to be coming to an end in a very real sense, insofar as modernity stems from the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment, these ideas which have culminated in liberalism and progressivism, are now falling apart. And that opens up a plethora of possibilities if only we have the vision and the patience to attempt to perceive them.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And we should try to, for example, during the 30s, it was the fascists that decided to have parallel institutions, but these parallel institutions were already pre-established to be on the side of more militaristic approaches because of they already knew they were going to war, so they also have a very militaristic mindset to themselves, to their ideologies. But for example, in today's world, we can set up like they were trying to do parallel institutions. We can set up parallel academias, parallel center of studies, which is, for example, what we have been doing with the Center of Studies Center for Crisolism Studies. We have a couple of philosophers over there, a couple of even mathematicians, a lot of different things, or even, for example, physicists. Physicists don't have this many access to other things that, for example, previously they were restricted to, for example, even in the side of sciences like physics. It's like they cannot because of the limitations that they already have within the academia, they cannot bridge some gaps that they previously had. There are topics that are, for example, you not doesn't matter what happens, you do not touch that topic. So for us, it's not that we have a certain much more. We are much more dynamic in this sense. We try to make use of what we have at this right moment because, of course, we would want to have much more, academic resources, much more books, much more authors, much more. Spaces to discuss this, but we don't have that. So we gotta work with what we have at this right time. So this is also how design ties in with the overall conversation, and because it's we're talking about today, right now in 2019. We are not talking about 30 years ago or during the Cold War, like the Marxists like to do. So this proves like what you were saying, John. This proves that this is a very big opportunity for us to set up these new organizations. And also, I gotta add, for example, this might surprise you guys, but I am actually an IT guy. By any means, I shouldn't be around this type of books. For me, I should be reading, the new legislation on IT and all these kind of things. But because of the situation we are in, it's like I don't have the luxury to do that. I have to read these books. I have to have these ideas. I have to try at least because it's like a duty that I have. It's not because I like it to a point because of course it's very refreshing to have these conversations, but it is not my economic duty to do this. But my people need it, so here I am. So that's just it.
And we know one has to start somewhere, Zero. And I think that, the fact that even in very, very small contexts, people are beginning to have conversations like this. People are willing to put the time in that's necessary to produce podcasts like this, of this kind of quality with these kinds of ideas. That's already a great deal. In many cases, I know that when you compare it to the weight of the institutions that we're attempting to critique, when you compare it to the power of the individuals that we are attempting in some way to undermine, it seems to be very little in many cases, but it really, in the end, is not so little, is it? Insofar as, you plant an apple seed and you can't expect to eat an apple the next day, right? You have to give these things time, and so much can come out of so little. A conversation like this that goes to touch on so many absolutely essential points. This opens up windows. It opens up doors potentially. It's very, very important that these things are happening now. And the fact that you're willing to spend your time reading these books when maybe you would rather be doing something else, I think that's true for many of us. And that sense of duty will carry us very far, I think.
And also, I might add that this is in fact exactly the sort of educative experience that people should be having in university, which they're not getting. So even though these aspects seem to be very small as in terms of podcasts or that kind of thing, they all count as an education, if you know what I mean. And it is, I think, especially now the way the world's going, I think this is one of the primary vehicles of getting new and fresh ideas out there, is by having these conversations. People can listen to them privately without having to be seen to be connected or anything. And they can digest and start to implement. I think this is the way forward, especially in the education sense, because education is where you're going to get the most.
It's like we've lost Martin, but I would say that what Martin was saying is absolutely true. This is preparatory work, and I would add to that just one further thought that it's educational as well for we who are involved in these podcasts, insofar as it gives us the opportunity to discuss these ideas with people who come from very, very different countries, very, very different contexts. And this is another aspect of this kind of global opening that we see, this opening of new possibilities and new ideas. So to that extent, I know I thank you very sincerely, Zero, for this podcast. I thank as well all of the participants in it. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to say as much to Israel as well, but this is an excellent opportunity and an excellent thing that you're doing. So. Yeah, compliments and more power to you.
Thank you. We also have this hypothesis, like, for example, these people, these douchebags, like here, Henry Kissinger himself, they are always toying with this idea of the nukes, the nuclear power and all that. But I have another idea because I was even in things like anime, for example, I was watching this guy that pulled out a meteor out of nowhere, and I was like, and the subtitle was "The Power of a God," and I was like, holy crap, he's facing an army by himself, and then he throws a meteor at them, and he said, and all these people they have incredible abilities. They happen to stop the meteor, and he basically says, "Oh, that's cute, but guys, let me ask you, what are you going to do about the second one, though?" And the sky opens, and there is a second meteor, and it completely obliterates everyone. So it's like, for example, for us, it's the idea to for example, we have already published our golden book, which is, I don't have it here, I have it on my other room. That Liberalism. Yeah, we have they published, for example, Gaddafi has the green book, Mao has the red book. We have the golden book. We have the golden. Yeah, fitting. Yeah, we have the golden. We have the golden book of Crisolism, and we have published it kind of recently. So I don't know if you guys are interested in maybe reading a broad translation of that, and maybe if you have
Absolutely would be. Absolutely would be.
yeah, if you happen to be interested in that, we can arrange, maybe we can publish that through you, because to us it's more about spreading the virus, like there is a Mexican saying. It says "La plaga nunca muere," the plague never dies. So that's what we try to do. And also Guillaume Faye talks about the German. So the German, the virus, the plague, it follows the same pattern.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So any closing statements that you guys might have, because we are already hitting we're almost at 3. Yeah. No. Yeah. 3 p.m. EST. We are almost near the closing hour. So do you have any closing statements that you might want to make?
I would just like to personally thank you all very, very much for the opportunity to come on your show once again, and to thank you as well for a highly stimulating and educational conversation.
Yes, I'd like to second that, and I find a lot of the concepts we're discussing in terms of Peru to be extremely interesting, and I wish you very much the very best in success in pushing that movement forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You, Rafael, do you have any other questions that you might have had during the overall conversation?
Well, I was just sitting back listening. It's a very big brain kind of went over my head sometimes, but I did learn a lot. I want to thank these two guys for coming on. It seems like the European nationalists are a little less autistic, a lot more open up to talking to people that are, quote unquote POC out in the world. And thank you for your insight, and hopefully those guys in Peru can help get some information from you to help improve their movement as well.
Yeah, definitely, because this is I wanted to add some to what you were saying, Martin. Here we have this concept that is education is the thing, is the information that you already have, all these the courses that you go through academia, through high school, all of these things. But formation is different. Formation is what you yourself have to do in order to further your knowledge by yourself, by your own will, by your own willpower. That's the difference I wanted to make on these terms. But in any case, that would be it for me, from my end. So do you guys want to plug something?
Yes, please. Dear listeners, please do visit our site at arktos.com. That's ARKTOS.com. We have a journal up there as well, in which we talk about some of the issues that we've discussed during the course of this podcast, and many similar and related issues as well. Martin and I are the hosts of Interregnum Podcast, which is anywhere from a bi-monthly to weekly podcast from Arktos, and we host conversations with our authors and with a variety of other individuals. So please do check out our website, and I think that's about it.
Yes, you can find the podcasts on our website, and also if you just type in Arktos Media into
Yes.
YouTube, you'll find our channel. And there's about, I don't know, about 30 or 40 there, I think.
Have we done that many?
So if that's just it, we are going to end this conversation over here. And please, you guys check out Arctos. Definitely, there are very interesting books, very interesting works. Like for example, my boss was talking about ambientalism. Here we have authors like Pentti Linkola that are talking about ecologism. So it's a similar it's a similar conception, but it's the etymology is just different. But it's basically what he was trying to say. But in any case, guys. So if you what to add? Oh yes, please stay tuned for more content coming from us, from more content coming from Arctos, and this will be it. I thank you guys for coming, and thank you all our listeners to be very keen on these ideas, and further they should as well try to further get this and develop their own thinking, their own hypotheses regarding some of these issues, because we actually do need new ideas right now, and that's will be just about it. Thank you once again, and thank you all of the audience to be listening, and we will see you by next week. Bye bye.